Good job, Sadie. Yaseh.
Good morning, everyone. It was my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Artson, at synagogue on Shabbat, and I will not inflict on him another long introduction to himself, since he already knows himself. But as you are aware, Rabbi Artson is the Abner and Roz Goldstein Dean of the rabbinical students at Ziegler, and also this weekend, the Abner and Roz Goldstein Scholar in Residence at Sinai Temple. He is one of America's most important teachers and preachers of our tradition, and a special treasure to our community that Rabbi Artson has made his life and career here in Los Angeles. So without further ado, although I'm not quite sure what ado is, but I know you don't want any more of it. Here's Rabbi Artson.
So yesterday, the little known fact that they shared was that I grew up with a pet octopus. Today, what I'll tell you that is little known is that Rabbi Wolpe and I had the pleasure of taking a Kabbalah class while studying in rabbinical school together. There was a visiting Israeli scholar who is a genius. And the challenge with him was we never knew whether we didn't understand what he was saying because he spoke Hebrew with no vowels, or because it's Kabbalah, so who knows what they're talking about. But the two of us kind of helped each other survive that course. Otherwise, we might to this day still be students in rabbinical school banging to get out. So I want to share with you some thoughts I have on an unusual topic. I want to talk about what is the idea that the Jews are the chosen people mean for us today? What can it mean? And the short answer that I want to give you is I used to think that chosenness was a theological claim. And I don't think that anymore. I think it's a historical reality. So you can like it or not, but I don't think Jewish chosenness is something you believe in or don't. And I want to present the evidence to you today. Right? We're all on board for that? That certainly doesn't mean you have to agree with me. Nobody agrees with me. But here's what I think. A couple years ago, I was on a plane. I have a rule when I'm flying, and that is never, when the person next to you asks, "What do you do for a living?" never tell them you're a rabbi. It always ends badly in one of two ways. If they're Jewish, you trigger them to tell you every bad Hebrew school experience they ever had as though it's your fault. And the other possibility is that they're not Jewish, in which you get every cockamamie idea they have about the Jewish people. Sometimes I forget. Normally what I tell people is that I'm a professor of medieval philosophy. Nobody has anything to say to a professor of medieval philosophy. But sometimes I forget, and I blurt out I'm a rabbi, which I instantly regret. And one time, the woman next to me responded by saying, "I'm so glad that God chose your people." And I, being me, said, because I had already gone that far in, I said, well, I'm not always comfortable with the idea of being chosen. And she got offended. And she said, we Christians consider ourselves the branches grafted onto the tree. And if the tree rejects its roots, where does that leave us? So, that's interesting. So let's talk about the tree and its roots, shall we? At the very core of the Torah's story is the idea of God's multiple choosing. God chooses an individual, Abraham and Sarah. Then God chooses a family, their raucous and ill-disciplined children. And then God chooses a people. The rabbis understand the event at Sinai like a wedding, in which Sinai, the mountain, was held over us like a chuppah, like a wedding canopy. And that combined story of the exodus from Egypt, going to Sinai, and there being wedded to the creator of the universe, that is at the heart of everything Jewish ever since. And there's chosenness for you. God marries the Jewish people. And we have been married to each other ever since. And I am assuming I'm not the only one who will point out that marriage has seasons. It has neighborhoods. There are times where you're closer. There are times where you're less close. Those are the times, by the way, I'll just point out where you want to be extra careful what you say. And you trust that the closeness will return. But marriage is a waxing and waning and a commitment to hold on regardless. So we are in this wedded relationship to the Ribono Shel Olam, to the creator of the world. And there's a kind of mutual commitment in it. We do mitzvot, we study Torah, God continues to fill our hearts and our minds with Torah, and then God's supposed to bring blessings and security. I don't mean to be critical here, but I think there are some quality control issues on the other side of the relationship. Okay, but to God's credit, we did get the gift of the land of Israel. That was nice. And we do get Olam Haba, the world to come. Right? So the Talmud teaches, Kol Yisrael yesh lachem chelek le'olam haba. Every single child of Israel has a place in the coming world. Our liturgy is built on this notion of mutuality, chosenness, covenant. So I don't mean to raise a sore point, because I wasn't here this year for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. By the way, that's one of my criticisms. But we say Avinu Malkeinu. And by we say it, I mean the cantor belts it out and a 12-person choir and an organ plays in the background. But Avinu Malkeinu is this beautiful blend of God's majesty and intimacy. Our parent, our sovereign. And that's not the only place. We take the beautiful words of the prophet Jeremiah and we turn that into a song. We are your people and you are our God. You are the potter and we are the clay. Again, this magnificent mutuality and intimacy. And that itself is a reflection, I mentioned, of the Exodus and Sinai, but also the book of Leviticus, where we hear, Kadoshim Tihiyu, you shall be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. We are wedded to each other. We are partners with each other. Now, here I want to highlight that this chosenness can move in two very different directions. One of them is that God chose us because we're the best. We're just better than everybody else. And so naturally, God fell in love with us. And because of that, there have been Jews, and that is reflected in a strain of Jewish thought, which we'll talk about in a bit, that we can never be defeated. Right? Those of you who are careful readers of Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible, know that the Davidic family was promised that they would always sit on the throne in Jerusalem, and that Jerusalem would always be ours. Turns out that was a bit of an overstatement, right? But a good deal of biblical theology and of rabbinic theology is predicated in that. Indeed, the beliefs around a Messiah are, in a sense, a way to redeem that promise. A promise that wasn't true for 2,000 years, but there was a sense of it will be true someday. It will be fulfilled eventually. There's a notion among some Jewish sages and thinkers that we're the only ones God truly loves. And that's a very short jump from we're the only ones that God really loves to nobody else is lovable, to nobody else is worthy. And that leads to a whole segment of Jewish thinking in which we argue not only are we the only religion and everyone else is idolatrous, but our version of Judaism is the only Judaism. And anyone who's practicing a way of being Jewish different than our own is also somehow unworthy, offensive, divisive. But that isn't the only way it has been interpreted. There's an equally large number of sages and scholars across the year who understood our chosenness not as a reflection of our nature, but of our mission. That what we do is what makes us chosen. And so to the extent that we are engaged in the Jewish job, which is to live lives of Torah, to build communities of worth, to be able to stand in the world for certain values founded on human dignity, diversity, and equality, that when we do that, and when we engage in the mitzvot, which are a behavioral pedagogy of righteousness, that is what attracts God's love and favor. And that means that we treat chosenness as a sentence fragment. If a child or grandchild comes home from school and says to you, I was chosen in class today, the response is, that's great, honey. Chosen for what? And that's a reasonable response to the Jewish claim for chosenness. We were chosen, great. For what? And that for what becomes our focus. That approach to chosenness opens up a different set of possibilities. If we were chosen for what, then someone else can be chosen for something else. This notion of chosenness opens up the possibility that everybody is chosen. But we're all chosen for different things. And that therefore the right response is, can we be the best possible version of the Jewish people? And we don't have an interest in stopping other people from being who they are. Let the French be French. Let the Argentinians be Argentinian. Let the Catholics be Catholic. Let the Buddhists be Buddhist. Their chosenness is for something else. But we have to be true to our chosenness, to our mission. And there too, there's support for that. The Talmud clearly teaches that the righteous of all nations have a place in the world to come as well. You don't have to be Jewish to inherit paradise. You just have to be true to yourself. Now I want to pivot and I want to shift. One of the books that I impose upon my first-year rabbinical students is Yehudah Ha-Levi's Kuzari. Yehudah Ha-Levi, some of you know because he's in your prayer books. He was a great medieval poet. He was a bit of a rebel. He was one of the earliest proto-Zionists in the Jewish world. Having started off in Spain, he was determined to end his life in the land of Israel. And in addition to his poetry, he wrote a remarkable book of anti-philosophy, which was one of the great stories generated in the medieval period. So I need to tell you a little history before I get into this. There was, once upon a time, a great ancient medieval kingdom that converted to Judaism. It was in a very bad geographical region, in a really not good time. So they were located south of Christian Orthodox Russia and north of the Dar al-Islam, the Islamic world. That's a bad place to be. And the royal family, the Khazar family, decided that the way to solve that problem diplomatically was to be none of the above. So they converted to Judaism. Their people did not. The Khazar people, nobody back then was interested in what common people did anyway, but the entire nobility for a good 200-300 years practiced a non-rabbinic form of Judaism. And you can imagine, for the oppressed Jews in Tunisia, Morocco, Spain, France, the idea that somewhere in the East there's a powerful kingdom in which the big shots are Jewish, that fired the imagination. So Yehudah Ha-Levi tells a story about how this happened, and it's fiction, but it's brilliant. He argues that this pagan Khazar king was trying to figure out what to do with his life, and he kept having nightmares that his life was unworthy, that it wasn't going to amount to anything. So he decided to try to fix that by calling in a philosopher. And the philosopher tried to persuade him that doing philosophy itself would make his life better, and that worked until he asked the fatal question, well, tell me, are philosophers more moral than everybody else? You know the answer to that question. So he said, well, if it doesn't make a difference in how they live their lives, why bother? Okay. Then he just said, as an alternative, I'll bring in some religious leaders. So he brought in a Catholic priest who tried to explain to him why he ought to be Christian. And he listened along and he said, I have two problems with that. He said, one is, you guys keep going to war against each other. Right? If Christianity is the path of peace, how is it you're all killing each other? Why do you have knights with swords and shields and spears if you're the religion of peace? Hard to answer. So he asked him again, I have a second question for you. If you couldn't be Christian, what would you be? And the priest said, if I couldn't be Christian, I'd be Jewish. Because at least they have the prophets of Israel, they worship the God of Israel, so that would be my fallback. Okay, he stored that away. He brought imam to teach about Islam. He got the same story. He said, same question, you guys are waging war everywhere you go, right? I don't think you're behaving better than other people do. If you couldn't be Muslim, what would you be? And the imam said, well, I couldn't be Christian because they worship a human being. So I suppose if I had to, I'd be Jewish because at least their religion is the forerunner to ours, and their patriarchs are our patriarchs as well. So that led to what I like to call the Harvard of the South insight. When I was on a college tour, I'm going to say something incredibly snotty here. When I was on a college tour for high school, we went to schools in the South where they would brag that they were the Harvard of the South. And then we went to schools in the Middle States where they told me they were the Harvard of the Middle States. And then we went to Harvard where they just said they were Harvard. So I went to Harvard. It occurred to the Khazar king, if everyone's fallback position is Judaism, maybe I should look into Judaism. So he brings a sage, Jewish sage, and the guy starts to tell him the Jewish story, but he doesn't start with creation, he starts with revelation. He starts with Mount Sinai. And the king says, this is bizarre. Why are you not starting with the creation of the world? And the Jewish sage told him, the creation of the world doesn't lead to anything particular. Everybody is the beneficiary for the creation of the world. But what leads to a way of life is a God who reaches out to talk to you. And then he offered a proof for the Torah revelation that I want to share with you. I'm not going to give you time to break it, but I'm going to tell you, in all the years I've taught philosophy, I offer this challenge to my rabbinical students. They have never solved the problem. Yehudah Ha-Levi proves that the Torah revelation is true. He says it's not a matter of theology, it's a matter of history, and here's how he proves it. The proof of Jesus' resurrection is that when they came to the grave was empty. Does that prove that he had to be resurrected from the dead and is sitting on the right hand of God? No. Anybody who's been to the Middle East knows that empty graves are pretty common. So nobody saw him resurrected. It wasn't witnessed. All they saw was an empty grave. How about the Quran? Did anyone see the angel dictating the Quran to Muhammad? No, he was alone in a cave. And then he came out with this book, and the first person to believe it was his wife, Fatima. I happen to be in a marriage in which I suspect my wife often agrees with things I say simply to end the conversation. Sorry, honey. So that's in private too. Notice that doesn't disprove Christianity or Islam. It just, they're making a big claim based on something private. But, he says, the Torah claims to be given in public. And here's the thing about something that you claim happens in public. The first generation, the generation who were there for it, if you claim something happened publicly, someone's going to say, what are you talking about? That didn't happen. I'll give you two for instances. Remember when the economy tanked in 2007, 2008? You all nod your head. Yes, I sure remember that. Because it was a public event and we were alive. But do you remember when it rained purple giraffes yesterday? You're going to start checking my medications, right? So The Torah claims it was given in public. And that, says Yehudah Ha-Levi, is unique among all the revelations. What would have happened if Moses had said to the Jewish people, you all saw the giving of the Torah. You were there at the foot of Mount Sinai. You heard the thunder and the lightning. You heard God's voice. You saw God call me up to the top of the mountain. You were witnesses of that. That first generation, if they weren't witnesses of that, what would they have done? They would have said, you're making it up. So the key to Ha-Levi's argument is the claim that it happened in public. For the second generation, it's just tradition, like everybody else. But for the first generation to allow the story to be told to the second generation, it had to have happened. I ask my rabbinical students to tell me what's wrong with that argument. Thus far, I have never been given a satisfactory answer. We all have this intuition, something's wrong with that, but it's very hard to put your finger on what it is. So based on that, he says the giving of Torah is not theological, it's historical. The interpretation of Torah, that for sure is theological. What the Torah means for us today, that's your business to decide. But that it was given by God in public, that's a matter of history. Which means that for him, chosenness is a matter of the historical record. And of course, what he has to answer in the medieval period is, if we're chosen, why is it so difficult to be a Jew? And he gives a related answer to that. He has two metaphors. The first is the canary in the coal mine. You all know you bring the canary into the coal mine because they're more sensitive to the lack of oxygen. So that if you see the canary start to act sick, you get everybody out. The Jews are like that. He says we are like the heart compared to the other organs. Right? The heart is the organ that gets sick when the system isn't working. So it's not always a defect of the heart, it's a defect of the system. So when mankind acts with greed and selfishness and violence, the Jews suffer first and most. Not because of anything we do or don't do, but because we are the heart of humanity. And he then says, and that's why Torah, Nevuah, only happens with the holy people in the holy place. Within the land of Israel, that's the only place prophecy occurs. Because you need to have the people who are the heart of humanity located in the place that is the heart of the world. Now, there's an underbelly to this kind of chosenness. The underbelly is a kind of Jewish supremacy which has reared its head throughout our history and continues to. So, in the Kuzari, I'll read you a paragraph of his. Wouldn't it have been preferable for all animals to be rational? You have forgotten in this connection about the succession of Adam's progeny, and how the prophetic divine order dwells within an individual who's the best of his brothers and the choicest offspring of his father, so that one succeeds another continuously and inherits that light. And the other children are like husks, who did not receive it until the children of Jacob came on the scene as the choicest offspring and the best of their father. And they differ from the other children of Adam by virtue of a special divine distinctiveness, which made them as though they were a different species and a different, even angelic substance. Let's be clear what he's saying here. We are not related to the rest of humanity. We are angels and they are dogs. That's a big thing, isn't it? That's not something that stops with the Kuzari. So the Alter Rebbe, the Chabad rabbi who wrote the Tanya, which is the founding document of the Chabad movement, and there's much beautiful about Chabad. So don't hear this as a criticism of Chabad in general, but it is a criticism of one of their cornerstone ideas. The Tanya says that Jews have a divine soul and Gentiles have an animal soul, which means a Gentile can never become a Jew. Like, they can practice the mitzvot, they can do all of that, but they will never change souls. And that wasn't just an idea in the Tanya. The most recent Chabad rabbi, Rabbi Schneerson, wrote, "In our day and age, one does not have to be a Chassid or even a Kabbalist or even a confirmed believer as long as one does not close one's eyes to the stark facts to see what kind of souls the nations of the world have. For all the nations of the world were witnesses to what took place in Germany and the countries that it overran, yet they remained indifferent. In light of this, the words of the Alter Rebbe may even be an understatement." Get that? Divine soul, human soul, and the most recent Chabad Rebbe says that's an understatement. Rav Kook, beloved Jewish mystic, he writes, "The difference between the Jewish soul, itself, its inner desires, its overflow, its character, its standing, and that of all the nations, at all their levels, is greater and deeper than the difference between the human soul and the soul of an animal. Between the latter, there is merely a quantitative distinction. Between the former, an essential qualitative distinction pertains." This is a part of Jewish thought that continues to this day. And we hear it from some segments both in America and in Israel. And I want to just say here, it's very ugly. And it is toxic. But now I want to get to my evidence for why I believe chosenness is a fact. Let me start with something that I learned from my friend and colleague, Rabbi Wolpe. Do you know what percentage of humanity is Jewish? About 0.2. That means that the percentage of humanity that are not Jewish is 99.98%. That's a lot. Do you know what the English word for a non-Jew is? That is to say, for the 99% of humanity. Is there an English word for that category? Gentile. That's crazy. Do you know what the English word for not Chinese is? It doesn't exist. That's a fourth of humanity. And there's no word for not being in that category. The word for not being French, the word for not being English, the word for not being Christian. There's no words for that. But in English, I'm not talking about in Hebrew, that we would have a word for non-Jews, I get. But Western people have a name for people who aren't Jewish. That's crazy. Do you remember saying that? Here's another thing that's only true of us that I don't for the life of me understand. Can you think of any other group where their identity is contested and other people claim to be the real ones? So let me just be clear about that. There are people out there saying, we are not Jews, they are. Part of me wants to say, geh gesund or hate. You know, I'm happy to take a break for a while and be a Gentile. But how wacky is that? Is there anybody in the world saying, you guys aren't real Americans, we are? Like who aren't American? Are there any people who say, you're not Nigerian, we are? And they're like not from Africa? It's crazy. First of all, who would want to be us? And second of all, why are they so incentivized to say we're not us? But there it is. And it's not just one group. There are actually several different groups competing for who's actually us. Have you thought about how nuts that is? Okay. Third, can you think of another people who rise onto the historical stage and then just keep going? Where is Pharaonic Egypt? Where is ancient Greece? Where's imperial Rome? Where's Tsarist Russia? These nations rise and crash, and rise and crash, and we are the ever-ready rabbits of history. We just keep marching forward. Now, I have a theory about this. Hear me out. I think that's because other nations associate themselves with things that matter. Land acquisition, power, wealth, oppression. And we argue about which end of the egg comes out of the chicken first. And if the chicken lays its egg on a Friday afternoon, are you allowed to prepare it on the Sunday of Yontif? We scream at each other about this stuff while nations rise and fall all around us, and we're too distracted to notice. We just hear a loud noise and we look out the window and go, what was that? And back to the egg. But for whatever reason, here we be. And people have been predicting our demise from the moment we started. Can you think of another nation like that? I can't. Or, related to that, can you think of another nation where the entire world identifies with its heroes? Let me put that in two ways because it's related to that. We started out a small Canaanite people, along with Hittites and Hivites and Girgashites and Perishites, who, by the way, have been underperforming for a long time. And the whole world thinks that they are the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You can talk to someone whose people were marauding Vikings, and they think they have a stake in that story. Do you know how wild that is? You can talk to people whose ancestors were kidnapped in Chad or Guinea who have a stake in this story. They think it's their story, which it is, but that's extreme. Nobody identifies with the Epic of Gilgamesh. Right? This is the best-selling book every day in the world. And the other books that sell because they're ripping it off. I'll give you one example of that. The greatest literary achievement in our time, other than the books of Rabbi Wolpe, are the Harry Potter series, just measured in terms of firepower. It's our story. It's about a kid of uncertain parentage who gets raised by strangers, who discovers at some point that he's not part of where he's from, he's actually part of a different world. He ends up with magical, unexplainable powers, and his job is to vanquish the bad guy and lead people into freedom. That's the Harry Potter story. Where have I heard that before? Right? That story has been liberating humanity for all times. It's just an obscure Iron Age, ancient Near Eastern legend. But it's become the story of the world. How do you explain that? How do you explain that we receive disproportionate attention? I want to remind you the teaching of Tevye. Chosenness is not always so great. Remember when Tevye turns to God and said, would you mind choosing someone else for a while? Right? So how do you explain that even in places where we've never lived, there are anti-Semites? Rabbi Wolpe and I were kibitzing before, and I don't know that he agrees with this, but it's my feeling that the only ones who have the right to be anti-Semites are those of us who work with actual Jews. We've earned it. But people who haven't put in any time hate us, and they don't know us well enough to hate us. And here's the flip side of that. Do you know the most attractive category for American women to marry? This kills me. It kills Ilana even more. Do you know that if you ask American women what category man would you most prefer to marry, they say a Jewish man. Ilana insists that's because they haven't spent time with us. I think it's because we're just utterly charming. Thank you for that. That was a man clapping. But how do you explain that? Right? How do you explain that there were no UN resolutions last year about China, about Tibet, about Nigeria? You know where this is going. And there were 15 about Israel. Even if you think Israel is doing something bad, so were some of those other people who no one notices. So how do you explain the fixation? How do you explain that the solutions proposed for China and Tibet is that China change its policy, and the solution proposed for Israel's policy issues is get rid of the whole country? So for all of these reasons, I no longer think that our chosenness is a theological claim. I think the nations of the world have demonstrated that, like it or not, we had better start living as though we are chosen. And I want to highlight what that means. The chosenness I'm talking about is the chosenness of the Rambam, not of Ha-Levi. I do not believe we are metaphysically different than other people. I believe that our mission is from God. And that, like it or not, frankly, believe in God or not, what's amazing to me is the number of secular Jews who still affirm the mission. The mission is to be a light unto the nations, to show what it means to be a caring community, to lift up the idea that all people have a God-given dignity and an equal worth, to insist that there has to be a day of work, that you're more than your labor, to be able to insist that we live in harmony with the earth and that the earth needs to rest just as do any other created creature. We have been teaching humanity what it means to be human from the day we started as a people. So believe in God or not, that is a matter of theology, but chosenness is not. And whether you choose to be chosen or you choose to reject it, you're stuck with it. There's no way to resign your position. The world will impose chosenness on us even when we want to walk away from it. But why would we walk away from the greatest mission ever? We are given the privilege of carrying this ancient, beautiful heritage, which lifts up ailing humanity and shines the light of love into the dark corners of the world. Who wouldn't want to be chosen?
Thank you for that beautiful, stirring, and important talk. I'm amazed that you did all that without mentioning Nobel Prizes. I don't get it. How do you talk about how great we are without saying that we won like a third of all the Nobel Prizes when we're 0.2 of the population? Isn't that enough? What else do you want?
I didn't mention it for two reasons.
Okay.
The first is, have you gotten a Nobel Prize? Have I gotten a Nobel Prize?
Not yet.
So I'm through with those people. The second is, more seriously, I think that's a fluke. It is an extraordinary fluke, but if you look, for example, at who's getting admitted to the top colleges these days, when I was going to school, about a quarter of the undergraduate population was Jewish. That hasn't been true for a while.
No.
So it may be that was partly because of the determination of immigrant parents that their children should have better lives. And I think the current generation of parents is not quite so desperate, except for the Asian parents, the Korean parents, immigrants from other groups.
I could disagree with you about that because, after all, so many of those winners were Jews from Central and Eastern and Western Europe who weren't immigrants. They lived there for a long time, all the physicists who were from Hungary, but we'll let it go. But just the Nobel Prizes, too.
He's not given up.
I did want to ask, you gave Yehudah Ha-Levi's explanation for anti-Semitism, but clearly this is, there are lots of reasons for anti-Semitism, and it can't solely be because we're the heart of humanity. How much do you think the idea of chosenness has contributed to, or is a spark to people not liking Jews?
Thank you. That was actually in the outline, but I didn't get to everything. I don't believe that anti-Semitism is caused by our claim of chosenness, any more than I believe that white racism is caused by black behavior. I think that anti-Semites use chosenness as an excuse for their own bigotry and violence. And I think we need to be very clear and firm about that. Bigotry is caused by bigotry, and then it looks for supporting arguments. So let me just be clear about that. There are individual Jews who behave badly, and I'm ashamed of them. But to turn that into that Jew did something reprehensible and therefore all Jews, that's the bigoted move that is not generated by anything we say or do. It's generated by their need to be hateful and violent.
And how much of, I'm going to flip the question now, how much of Jewish achievement, ambition, survival do you think is attributable to the fact that Jews believe they're chosen?
Yes. So that, I think, our affirmation that we are chosen, our willingness to embrace that, has contributed immeasurably. Don't forget that for most of our history, we were a downtrodden minority. And what that meant was that out in the world, we were buffeted all the time by the message that we are tainted and unworthy. But any Jew who came home and on Friday night lit candles and sat around that table and sang about the angels noticing us was for that evening the child of royalty. And that carried us through very difficult times. I believe that belief in our chosenness, which again, I think is not just a belief, I think it's an acceptance of a reality. I think that was a crucial component to Jewish survival and, frankly, to Jews surpassing themselves, right? Other people seem to be okay just having a good meal and going to sleep, and we need to change the world.
Right. That may also be because Jewish food is not, the Italians could have a good meal and go to sleep.
You are speaking like an Ashkenazic Jew.
I am speaking like an Ashkenazi Jew.
I will tell you should try some Persian food.
Go ahead, applaud. I know you want to. The part that you spoke about, that we've spoken about, I've spoken about a little bit, but that is so uncomfortable for Jews to acknowledge, which is that there is a strain of Jewish, we are just intrinsically better than other people. How much of that do you attribute? First of all, I first want to ask, how many minorities don't secretly feel that? I mean, do you think that there isn't in the Albanian community a sense of we're really better than the people around us?
Yes.
And second, how much of the turning it into a metaphysical, our souls are better, is a result of the fact that that was the only kind of revenge that Jews were able to take, was a kind of spiritual revenge?
So there's a lot that gets thrown into that. The fact that we are tempted to respond to our haters by saying, oh yeah, we're better than you, I get that psychologically. I certainly understand that. But it's a strain of thought so strong, particularly in the mystical tradition and in the Hasidic tradition,
Right.
and now in the kind of black hat Orthodox world, particularly in Israel, where it's resurgent. And in Israel, these people are not the out people. They're holding
Right.
great power, and the danger is I'm okay with it as a way when we're weak and oppressed to carry ourselves through tough times, but when we become powerful and dominating, then it becomes really deadly. Not only to Jews who then don't live that life, but to non-Jews around us who are under our power, it becomes deadly. So, yes, other people's, I think everyone sometimes, well, either secretly thinks they're better than everyone else or they're French.
So they openly think they're better than
They're
everyone.
overt
Right,
about
exactly,
it.
yeah,
Why hide it?
Right.
But I think it's different. I think that the mystical, look, there's a huge debate. Are Jewish ideas responses to things external, or are they generated? And the answer is almost always both.
Right.
So I think there are certainly external reasons to push some Jews in that direction, and then I think there's the need of all people to just think they're better. It's just, thank God we have people like Maimonides, like Rav Sadia, some of the great Jewish thinkers. The Talmud weighs in definitively and says, I understand psychologically why you want to say that, but it's forbidden. It's forbidden, right? Because among other things, we affirm, I know Sinai affirms this, that someone who isn't born Jewish, who joins the Jewish people, is 100% as Jewish as someone whose great-great-great-grandparents were already Jewish, right? If we're something you can become, then it's about the mission. And that, I think, is what the Torah holds us to.
We should say that those who, just because people may be wondering, those who believe that Jews are metaphysically different, but acknowledge that there are converts to Judaism, some of whom have made huge contributions, what they'll say is, this soul was originally Jewish, got lost somehow through the historic, and now is just returning. It's not actually a non-Jewish soul becoming Jewish.
Which, by the way, is, I think, as problematic. I've talked to Christian theologians who justify their belief that outside of Jesus there's no salvation by this idea that there are secret Christians. So if you're a righteous Jew, that's because you have, unknown to yourself, already affirmed Christ by your behavior, and therefore you count as in. I find that so distasteful, and it seems just as distasteful when Jews say that.
So you didn't, in other words, but it doesn't seem to me exactly, I mean, I don't like it either, but it doesn't seem to me exactly analogous, because what they're saying is you have rediscovered your true origin, which a lot of converts will say about themselves.
Yes, but, well, right. The difference is here, they're still making not a claim of, I've discovered the path that gives me meaning. It's that metaphysically, you are part of the angelic, not the animal, and your family who aren't converting, they're animals. Mm-hmm. That's the difference.
That's fair enough. So in the catalog, this is such a large and unanswerable question, but take whatever whack at it you'd like. In the catalog of things that plague Jews, how high is the fact that many Jews reject the idea of chosenness? How important is that in restoring Jews or the Jewish people to what we might be or should be, if you had a list of things that afflict us, which God knows is a long list?
It is. And I just want to say at the top of that list is funding rabbinical schools.
Right, yes.
One in particular.
Right. And synagogues.
Okay. Look, okay, I don't think the world will pivot if tomorrow every Jew signed a document saying, I affirm chosenness. But what chosenness is part of a web of values, and that, I think, is crucial. So recognizing the interlocking nature of Jewish values, Jewish community, Jewish engagement, Jewish practice, I don't see a meaningful Jewish survival without that web. How that web gets translated into actual lives will vary across communities and generations and individuals. But that web, I think, has always been essential and still is.
So I'm glad you said that, because it allowed me to, in my own mind, sort of refine the question or the point that I think is crucial here, which is that we're always talking about Jewish identity. And to affirm that you are chosen is a fundamental statement of identity. And you can't say, I'm a Jew and Jews are chosen, and not have a Jewish identity.
Right. That's right. So I think it is a crucial aspect of, and it's the way our people talk about how important that identity is. Yesterday, one of the things I mentioned to those who were here was that it's interesting, there's a good 40% of the Jews these days who claim to not practice any religion. And yet 95% of Jews say that their Jewish identity is very important. There's a bit of a contradiction in that.
Yeah. So I know you've had this experience as well. When my brother, who is a professor at the Harvard of the South, Emory, and so is the Dalai Lama professor there, although he no longer comes to Emory because he can't travel anymore. But so when my brother and I were traveling in India, we had an audience with the Dalai Lama in which the first thing that he said was he looked at me and said, what's this about chosenness anyway? First thing he said. And then I said, yeah, it's true that Jews believe they're chosen. I said, but we don't necessarily believe we're the only ones who are chosen. Other people can be chosen for different things. We're chosen for our mission. And he laughed and he said, yeah, Tibetans think they're chosen too.
There you go.
So I think it's pretty universal that.
Well, it's universal among Jews and Tibetans anyway.
Right. Isn't that everyone?
That covers it for me.
That's pretty much it.
Did he
Right.
give you one of the cloth things?
Well, he did. He spoke to the Emory students, and then I spoke to the Tibetan monks about how we survived in the diaspora, which is their great, And it was quite wonderful. He spent hours with the students, answered every question. One 18-year-old young woman from Emory. I was going to say girl because 18, when you reach a certain age, still seems like a kid.
Don't do it.
All right. Got up and asked him a question. His answer was, I'm, however old he was, 80 years old and Tibetan, so you have a lot to learn from me. He said, but I don't know what it's like to be an 18-year-old from Atlanta, so I have a lot to learn from you. Wow. Now that's a remarkable thing for us, for one of the great spiritual leaders in the world to say. So yeah, he was and he's a great experience.
He's brought in Jews regularly because he recognizes that Jewish survival is counterintuitive and really unlikely. That's just another way of saying we're chosen. I mean, that's kind of what chosen means, is that the universe has an interest in our perpetuation.
And how much do you think we have undersold this theme in non-Orthodox Judaism?
I think we have backed away from it because it doesn't easily fit with our general liberal assumptions. And here I want to be explicit, because it's Sinai. By liberal, I don't mean Democrat. I mean, there's a broad classical liberalism that embraces the two major parties in this country, and that liberal rhetoric is very uncomfortable with chosenness, in part because, and here's an irony, Christian triumphalism, you can't go to heaven without Jesus, is an exclusive claim of superiority.
Right.
Right? Jewish chosenness, outside of that, the group I spoke about, is not. It's what Rabbi Wolpe said to Hello Dolly, right? That there's we each have a mission, and we all need to be true to our mission. So I think chosenness gets filtered through supremacy, but I don't think that's what it's about.
And speak to how much the idea of chosenness has gotten woven into the fabric of Americanness, because America clearly thinks of itself as a chosen nation.
Yes. Look, I love the fact that when the Continental Congress was creating this country, Ben Franklin, who's one of my heroes in the world, Ben Franklin proposed that the seal of the United States should be the Israelites crossing through the sea to dry land. Because he saw his battle as against a pharaoh with this oppressed but chosen people, which is why our cities have the names like New Canaan, because we were, and there's the underbelly of that too, that it's about supremacy. But here I want to also say the illiberal thing. I believe in American exceptionalism. I think this country is profoundly different, and in part because it has a sense of we carry liberty for humanity. And we are the ones who, if we don't carry that torch, no one will. And that people flock to us. Look what's going on in Ukraine right now. Look at the role we're playing in Ukraine. Like, that is our vision of what this country is at its best.
And part of the reason that that's so is exactly what the business with the egg. When you talk about how the Talmud argues this, which is the subject of a very famous essay by the German poet Heine about the egg and arguing about the egg, which is that America is founded less by a people than by an idea.
Right.
And Judaism, too, is an idea-driven creation.
I would even go so far, and we're moving a little away, but I think there's a reason why.
They're used to my sermons. We never stay on one topic. It's not a problem.
There's a reason why this country has been uniquely welcoming to its Jews. Even now with the rise of anti-Semitism, which is real and needs to be attended, if you had to pick whether you'd rather be a Jew in America or an anti-Semite in America, it's just clear that, we're a phone call away. There was a picture 2 weeks ago of the president walking his grandson into the White House for an overnight, and the kid was wearing Hanukkah pajamas because he's Jewish.
Right.
And the thing that I love to tell people is that the only thing that unites Biden and Trump is they both have Jewish grandchildren.
Right.
Right? So they meet at the Gan to pick up their grandchildren, Hi, Joe. Hi, Donald. And they have a little cholent, and then they go home. Right? But that, I think that America is founded on a story of diverse people coming together with a shared vision of freedom. And that's exactly the story of the children of Israel and the mixed multitude going to a land to establish a confederation of freedom.
And to combine a little bit yesterday and today, that is the future of Judaism and the chosenness, how do you, in a society where to assert any kind of specialness, especially if you look like both of us look, to assert any kind of specialness.
That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me.
By which I mean...
No, leave it alone.
Yeah, leave it alone.
Leave it alone.
Seriously, but I mean, how do you advance this message, not to Jewish audiences, but in general, when we live in a world in which to be a white male and to assert any kind of specialness or uniqueness or specialness, my thesaurus ran out for a second there, is going to get you clobbered in the marketplace of ideas.
So I'm sorry to nitpick. I have to nitpick one thing.
Please.
I am not a white male. I'm not. I'm done with American racial categories. So I'm not white, I'm Jewish. And I look white, except for, my Jewfro, but I'm not white. And I'm not going to check that box anymore, because it's their categories and not mine. The answer I want to give is the way we do that is by holding up that mirror to everybody. I think African Americans are heroic. They were ripped out of a place, their identity was taken from them, and they found resources of spirit to continue and to survive in a consistently hostile and bloody terrorist regime. And they've emerged to be the most avid defenders of American democracy that there is, right? When democracy is assaulted, Black Americans are at the forefront of every resistance. And so I don't think that it's a zero-sum game. That's what I hold out, is that everyone's distinctiveness makes America great. And I don't want anyone to flatten their uniqueness into some parve, neutral story. And in that celebration of the diversities by which we nurture each other, the Jewish diversity is a contribution. That's it.
So then, and I think this is exactly I don't want to say the productive, fruitful approach is for Jews to be able to insist on the uniqueness of other groups as well, without which we don't get to insist on our own.
Correct. And I want to say here, what is breathtaking, and we're back to my chosenness thing, is we piss off the crazy left and the crazy right whenever we insist on being ourselves.
Right.
Because we don't fit anybody else's categories. And tough. I'm done trying to fit other people's categories. So we know who we are by our enemies, and we also know who we are by the people who are themselves liberated by our refusal to fit other people's categories.
And when you say, I want to test out my theory, which actually accords a little bit. I'm going to talk about this in part on Wednesday night when I talk about anti-Semitism, but it seems to me that the reason, in large measure, that America has been so hospitable to Jews is that for most of our history, we were the identifiable other. They were like Russians and Jews or Frenchmen and Jews. But there aren't Americans and Jews. There are so many different groups that we're not, as you said, better to be a Jew than an anti-Semite in America.
Yes, and I think part of that we owe to the founders of this country and their separation of church and state, which was uniquely helpful to us. I think American encouragement of individual initiative fits Jewish culture.
Right.
So yes, I think that is a huge piece of why we were able to thrive.
So now speak to, if you would, although again, this is a big topic, but it's certainly, to have you here and not get your thoughts about this would be a shame. Speak to how the divisions within the Jewish community are manifesting themselves and making us less powerful and cohesive than we might otherwise be.
So, okay.
Well, I'm asking this because we don't, at Sinai, we're as one. So we don't understand how other parts of the Jewish community don't stand together the way we do.
Here's, I think, the challenge. We've been so embattled for so long that we've extended our frailty to each other. So it's not enough that you love Israel, you have to love Israel my way. And if you don't love Israel the way I love Israel, then you're either a capo or a murderer. And we do that to each other in every area. So we do that with my way of being Jewish is the only way to be Jewish, and your way leads to extinction. or fanaticism. And what we've lost is the ability to say, I'm doing the best I can to make sense of things, and this is what I think works for me and might have something to offer you. Tell me how you do it, and maybe I can learn from that too. Mm-hmm. And I've noticed that, for example, in the way left-wing Jews criticize right-wing anti-Semites, and right-wing Jews criticize left-wing anti-Semites. And nobody takes care of their own. And the way we talk about a cancel culture, and we identify people on the other side who are canceling, but we don't look at our people who are canceling. And we've lost that. Like, I do think the power of a place like Sinai can be that it vociferously nurtures a diverse center. And that takes courage, because that's not the age we live in. This is an age of fragility, and it's an age of, you've hurt my feelings, and therefore you're not allowed to say that. And that, I think, is going to pull us all down.
And how are you training rabbinical students to be other than that?
I insult them a lot.
I remember that from rabbinical school.
Yes, you do. Well, that was just practicing.
Right.
Well, I think that's the ongoing task. How in our age do we nurture diversity of style, of opinion, of practice within a shared parameter? I think we're mostly pretty good at that. You know, I'm pleased, for example, I've been disheartened by the way J Street and AIPAC have been assaulting each other. And I think that's dangerous for the Jewish people. I think they have strong points of disagreement, and I think they should have shared platforms where they argue with each other. But the way they've taken to insulting each other on the public media is just harmful to all of us who love Israel. And I think my students have been, by and large, pretty good about, there's a range of ways that we support Israel, and we nurture each other to be Zionist in the way we each understand it. And that, I think, has to be a role model for them to then take out into the world and share with their communities.
And how much of the internal discourse that is so difficult do you think arises from the fact that Jews are always have the sense, whether it's true or not, that they're like on the brink of existential obliteration?
Yes. So I think one is that we do all walk around with the sense of it's going to end with us.
Right.
And the second thing is, I don't think we're mingling much anymore. So we tend to know only people who think like we do. And, you know, we go to our synagogues and we sit with people who confirm everything we think. And then we only know the other people from the editorials that they put out, and that's never people at their best.
Right.
So I think if there's a way to start not only doing interfaith work, but intrafaith work, and start having conversations with Jews who don't agree with us, but to do it in a spirit of curiosity, and not necessarily to find common ground. You're fine having the opinions you have, but aren't you interested in why a decent human being would have a different way of putting it together? I think we need to create fora for those kinds of explorations.
I want to just, a story that came to me that I think I told over the high holidays, but I want to tell very quickly here, that struck me to go back to the real theme of your talk this morning, was that when I was in Rwanda and then read about the Rwandan genocide, the most famous book about that, which is "We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed Together with Our Families," the title is taken from a letter that was written by 7 priests, and then they were killed because the head of the church absconded with the letter and moved to Texas, of all places, and never helped them. But the last line of the letter, which he quotes in the book, Philip Gorovitch, who wrote the book, the last line of the letter is, "And we would be saved as Esther saved the Jews." And I just thought how remarkable it was that thousands of years later in sub-Saharan Africa,
Yes.
these people who are about to be killed, who do they look to as an example of salvation is this Jew from Persia from thousands of years ago and say, look, we want to be saved like she was saved.
And if I could build on that, another point of Jewish distinctiveness is that we feel responsible for each other, right? When a Jewish community suffers halfway around the world, that becomes an issue for us. I'm always amazed at the indifference of co-religionists of other religion to the suffering of their brothers and sisters, or ethnic groups who, well, that's a faraway community. And in our world, and you know this from the work of the Federation and the work of many of our agencies and the work of our synagogues, if a Jew suffers anywhere in the world, the Jewish community feels the pain and takes responsibility. Right. That also is a measure of our chosenness and of our sense of identity. Once we've liberated them, then we scream about how their opinions are wrong. Right. But we're going to do that, not other people.
And so I'm going to close with two more questions, and again, both open questions, so you can take them in lots of directions, about that business about how we all feel responsible for one another. One thing that often happens, and this is a debate that I've actually been on both sides of, so I'm not trying to over-egg the pudding, as they say in England. The reason that came to me, this is an aside, and then I will get back to, is I just heard this great story that is actually a story about Churchill, unlike most of the stories about Churchill that just get attributed to him, which is he grew up, even though he had a very difficult childhood, he grew up very privileged. And he never cooked in his life. And when he was older, his wife had asked him at one point if he could cook something. And he said, "I can boil an egg. I've seen it done." I just thought that was such a great line. So that's why I was thinking about over-egging the pudding. Is when you criticize Israel, what you get is, if you don't live here, you don't have a right to criticize. And both of those sides, both the criticism and the you don't have a stake in it, so you actually don't get to criticize, have, I think, really solid arguments on their side. So how do you feel about Jews outside of Israel criticizing Israel, and are there limits to that criticism? Nobody said it was going to be easy.
You're just making sure that I retire when you do.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Old man. So here's the thing. I
meant to say you look like me, but younger, is what I really meant to say.
I heard that.
Yeah.
I think the challenge for us, there is merit to both sides. We don't die in their wars. We don't suffer from this terrorist assaults. That is all true. We don't vote in their elections, and we shouldn't. I'm a citizen of the United States. I love Israel, but I'm not a citizen of the state of Israel. My kids don't serve in the military. All of that is true. And yet, my identity and Jewish life are unthinkable without Israel. And I have friends across the political spectrum in Israel who say to me the opposite. When you are silent, you're aiding the people who are causing our suffering, whoever they identify that to be. And there's merit to that too. So I want to say something about me personally and then something about the world in general, because I don't think it's the same standards. I will never publicly criticize Israel. And when I have something critical to say, I try to find an Israeli with some clout to say it to. So I have spoken to ministers of the Israeli government, and I've said, why are you not doing this? Or every time I see a picture of that, you're causing harm, like that. But I'm never going to say that to a newspaper. Mm-hmm. Because the way it gets used out in the world is, see, even Rabbi Artson admits that Israel is a murderous state that should be eliminated. Right. And there's no way for me to say something that won't be put in that context. Do I think everyone should follow that policy? I don't. I think there have to be a range of different responses now in which people put their views forward. But what I would say is any Jew who's going to say something about Israel has to start every single statement with the list of how they love Israel, they believe Israel has the right to exist, the Jewish people have the right to national self-determination, I have a difference about this policy, and here's how I think it should be corrected. And they can't just start with the last two. They have to go through the whole litany every single time. You may not like some of the politics, but my Rabbi Sharon Brous never gives a sermon critical of an Israeli policy without 20 minutes of all the ways she loves Israel and she and her family have made aliyah and are attached to it, and then comes the policy criticism every single time. And I think there is a need to express our views on Israeli policy choices. And those will be diverse, and we won't agree with each other, and Israelis are free to ignore them. But what I don't think they can do anymore is say that as American Jews, we have to be existentially connected to Israel and have no opinions. That I don't think is in Israel's best interest. I think sometimes someone far away is able to see something that you need to see, but the context has to be, we are family, we love each other. There have been people making statements recently about how their love of Israel is up for grabs, right? Nothing will stop me from identifying with Israel. No political choice of any Israeli government will ever stop me from loving Israel, but it will make me need to speak out about policies that they're following, right? If there are people who advocate what I see as intolerable racism or other policies, that is going to get a reaction.
Would you speak out about policies that have to do with the status of Jews in America, conversion, rabbis, who's recognized as a rabbi, what conversion counts in Israel, law of return, those sorts of things? Would you I'm not asking what your view is. I'm saying, would you speak out? Because those are policies that directly touch American Jews.
I don't. I will say I'm somewhat embarrassed by the way American Jews only speak out about their self-interest, and they don't speak out about moral and survival issues for the state. I think that that is a betrayal of who we are meant to be. That the only thing we squawk about is they don't let us pray at this part of the wall, and then policies that affect, for example, the economics of the middle class in Tel Aviv, we say nothing about, or how policies affect minorities in Israel, religious or ethnic, we say nothing about. I think that is unworthy of us.
And lastly, so one of the things that you and I have both devoted our lives to and keeps us up at night, I don't mean to speak for you, but I assume, keeps us, is that non-literalist Judaism is very hard to advance in this world. And you spoke about it yesterday, but I also want you to give us in summary what it is that is the most important thing that we can do to ensure the perpetuation of the kind of Judaism that we believe in and have given our lives to.
Sure. Look, I think there's a way in which, the great liberal theologians, Kaplan, Heschel, whatever, even when we got to the seminary in New York, the rhetoric was that we were American Judaism.
Right.
And Orthodoxy was going to be a small group to the right, and Reform would wither away, and we were, and that proves to have been, at best, premature. I think we didn't count on several things. One is the profound human need for certitude. it's harder to ask people. Louis Jacobs had a wonderful phrase. He said, I would rather be possibly right than certainly wrong. And people would prefer certainty, even if it's wrong, I think, by and large, because they're scared and they're on the defensive, and it's very assuring. I also think we never factored in what would happen when you took a bunch of Jews from places that had suffered terribly, by which I mean Arab countries and Russia, and they became a majority in Israel, right? When we were growing up, Israel was a socialist country with a left-wing vision. That hasn't been true for a long time, but that weighs into American Jewish institutional life for a lot of reasons. I go back to Solomon Schechter, wrote an essay called Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, which I know you know. And he raises the idea from British Parliament that a minority party has an important role to play. And it may well be that Reform, Reconstructionist, Conservative Judaisms are going to be Her Majesty's loyal opposition. That, I guess, His Majesty now.
Yeah, right.
Sorry, Liz. That we will not be the majority voice publicly, although we still are. You know, numerically, non-Orthodox Judaism is 70, 80% of American Jewry. But we're not the loudest, that's for certain. And maybe we have to be okay with that our voice adds something to the totality, just as, by the way, we have a great deal to learn from the Orthodox. I celebrate Orthodox vitality. They're doing several amazing, wonderful things that I benefit from and that we benefit from. So maybe instead of seeing this as a conquest view, there's a value to a Judaism that is diverse, egalitarian, non-gendered, still loving of Israel, loving of tradition. We have a role to play that I wouldn't trade, and I can't, because this is what I believe.
Right. I don't think you could have spent a more thought-provoking 90 minutes than we have this morning with Rabbi Artson. I want to thank him so much. And once again, to thank Abner and Roz Goldstein for making this possible, to thank the Sisterhood for this morning's breakfast, and thank all of you who've come and paid attention, and I hope that we will continue this dialogue over the months and years to come. Thank you. Thanks, Lord. Good. That's just great.